The Mi-24 Hind carried more armor than any helicopter ever built, titanium around every crew seat. Its pilots called themselves the Grey Wolves, elite, untouchable. By late 1986, those same crews had a new name, mandatory Matrosovs, men already dead. They carried pistols not for the enemy, but for themselves. Something entered Afghanistan that September with a 79% kill rate, and 333 Soviet helicopters would never return. This is the engineering failure behind the most armored rotorcraft ever flown. The very thing designed to keep crews alive is what got them killed. Soviet engineers approached the Mi-24 Hind as a problem of physics and probability. The Design Bureau's solution was armor, real armor, not just plating. 5 to 10 millimeters of titanium wrapped the cockpit in a protective shell, forming a bathtub around pilot and gunner. The windows were thick enough to stop 50 caliber machine gun fire, while the sides and belly were rated to deflect 23 millimeter cannon fragments. In the logic of Soviet combined arms doctrine, this was not excess. The Hind would insert troops under fire, hover over battlefield choke points, and survive direct hits from the same weapons that shredded lighter helicopters in Vietnam. Every kilogram of titanium was a calculated trade, the extra weight accepted in exchange for a margin of survivability. The engineers mapped the expected spectrum of threats: DSHK heavy machine guns, ZTR-PU anti-aircraft guns, even 37mm shells at close range. Armor was not an afterthought, but the core of the design, meant to guarantee that crews could take a hit and keep flying. For the first years in Afghanistan, the numbers seemed to bear this out. Numbers told the story better than any slogan painted on a fuselage. In the first half of the war, Soviet records counted 269 confirmed kills out of 340 combat helicopter engagements. That is a 79% success rate, more than double what Soviet analysts expected from Western-supplied SA-7 missiles, which managed just 30% in Middle East conflicts. Even on the ground, the comparison was stark. 333 Soviet helicopters were lost in Afghanistan, against 147 tanks. The implication was clear: rotary wing aviation was not just surviving, but dominating the battlefield. Inside the helicopter regiments, this statistical edge shaped a distinct identity. Pilots shared stories of Mi-24s limping home with shattered glass and pock-marked armor, but always making it back. The numbers bred a culture of pride and fatalism in equal measure. Survival felt like proof of skill, but also of belonging to a select group whose luck held, until the day it did not. The Grey Wolves wore their record like a badge, never suspecting that the very statistics they trusted were about to turn against them. September 1986 in Jalalabad. A Soviet Mi-24 Hind, armored to survive anything Afghanistan could throw at it, vanished in a column of smoke. The weapon responsible was not another DSHK or ZPU, but a shoulder-fired missile just delivered to the Mujahideen by the CIA, an FIM-92 Stinger. Within hours, Soviet command received the report. The helicopter had been hit from below, the missile tracking straight to the exhaust, ignoring flares and armor alike. The crew never stood a chance. The Stinger's infrared and ultraviolet seeker locked onto the Mi-24's unshielded exhaust, a vulnerability invisible to the original engineers. The missile closed at 750 meters per second, Mach 2.2. The Hind's best climb rate, 12.5 meters per second, was meaningless. In the time it took the pilot to react, the missile was already home. Titanium plating and ballistic glass, so effective against bullets and cannon shells, offered nothing against a heat seeker's logic. Soviet doctrine had dictated high-altitude flight to avoid ground fire, but in Afghanistan's valleys, the only escape route put helicopters squarely in the Stinger's envelope. Soviet intelligence at first misread the threat. The GRU classified the Stinger as an incremental upgrade over the SA-7, which had a 30% kill rate in earlier wars. But in the first 60 days, after action reports documented a pattern, helicopters hit, crews lost, countermeasures useless. The Stinger's dual spectrum seeker ignored the single band flares fitted to the Mi-24. The armor's weight, 10.9 tons loaded, meant the Hind could not outclimb or outmaneuver the missile. The logic of survivability had inverted. What kept crews alive against the threats of the 1970s now guaranteed their destruction by the technology of the 1980s. Inside the regiments, the psychological shift was immediate. The pilots who once called themselves the Grey Wolves started using a new term, mandatory Matrosovs, a bitter reference to Soviet soldiers sent on one-way missions in World War II. Colonel Alexander Rutskoy, a decorated Mi-24 pilot, described the mood in his memoir. He wrote, "We flew knowing that if we were hit, our armor would keep us alive just long enough to burn." Survival kits were quietly updated. The pistol, once a last resort against the enemy, became a final option for the crew. The Stinger had not just killed helicopters, it had killed the idea that engineering could guarantee survival. Every sortie became a test of a falsified premise, and every loss an indictment of the system that refused to adapt. Mi-24's engineering logic, armor equals survival, ran straight into the laws of physics. At a loaded weight of 10.9 tons, every millimeter of titanium that shielded the cockpit and belly also locked in a penalty: inertia. With its twin Isotov TV3117 engines, the Hind could, on paper, climb at 12.5 meters per second. But that figure was measured at sea level, under ideal conditions, with no external stores or heat suppressors. In the Afghan mountains, at high altitude and with full combat load, the real climb rate dropped further. Pilots knew the numbers by heart because their lives depended on them. The armor that shrugged off 50 caliber rounds and 23mm fragments left the helicopter heavy and sluggish. In a straight line, the Hind was fast, up to 335 kilometers per hour, but in a vertical climb, it could never outpace a missile. A Stinger missile's seeker locked onto the hottest spot it could find, the exhaust. The Mi-24's exhaust geometry, a byproduct of its inline engine layout, vented superheated gases directly outward, creating a thermal beacon. The titanium tub around the crew was irrelevant to the missile's logic. The exhaust plume, peaking at over 600 degrees Celsius, was visible to infrared and ultraviolet seekers from every angle except head-on. Even when engineers retrofitted heat suppressors, the added 180 kilograms cost precious seconds in climb rate, dropping performance by nearly 10%. The trade-off was inescapable. More weight meant less margin for maneuver and less hope of escape. Pilots described the dilemma as a trap. One Mi-24 commander recalled in a 1991 oral history that you could feel the mass. He said it was like flying a safe with wings. In the cockpit, the numbers played out with brutal clarity. At Mach 2.2, a Stinger closed the distance from launch to impact in less than 3 seconds. The Hind's best climb, even in theory, could buy only a few meters of altitude, never enough. The missile did not care about armor or pilot skill. It cared about heat, mass, and geometry. Soviet doctrine had assumed the battlefield would reward protection and firepower. A Stinger missile, once fired, covered the distance to a Mi-24 at 750 meters per second, more than twice the speed of sound. For the pilot, the math was unforgiving. Even if the launch was detected instantly, the helicopter's best theoretical climb rate, 12.5 meters per second, offered no escape. In the time it took for the missile to travel 1 kilometer, the Hind could gain only a handful of meters in altitude. The geometry was absolute. At typical engagement ranges in Afghanistan's valleys, the missile closed the gap in less than 3 seconds. Soviet attempts to retrofit heat suppressors only added weight, further degrading climb performance. The missile's dual spectrum guidance, infrared and ultraviolet, meant that standard flares, designed for older threats like the SA-7, were ignored. Soviet after-action reports documented the same pattern. Flares deployed, missile continued tracking, impact at the engine bay, catastrophic fire. Of the 340 Stinger launches recorded by Western and Soviet observers between 1986 and 1989, 269 resulted in confirmed kills. That is a 79% success rate, compared to just 30% for the SA-7. The Mi-24 accounted for at least 27 of those kills, with some estimates placing the true number closer to 80, a figure masked by Soviet reporting practices and the chaos of recovery in hostile territory. Each loss followed the same forensic chain: missile lock, no effective countermeasure, turbine destruction, total loss of aircraft and crew. The Stinger's proximity fuse and high-explosive warhead did not need a direct hit. Detonation within 1 meter of the exhaust could shred turbine blades, rupture fuel lines, and ignite the main gearbox. Survivability, once defined by the thickness of armor, now depended on physics the original designers had not considered. In the calculus of missile closure, the Hind was always out of time. The result was not a contest, but a foregone conclusion, one that played out again and again in the statistics of loss. Soviet engineers responded to the Stinger crisis with a familiar toolkit: add more technology, modify the airframe, increase countermeasures. The first fix arrived in early 1987. New ASO-2V flare dispensers were installed, designed to flood the sky with decoys and break the missile's lock. In theory, these flares would blind infrared seekers. In practice, the Stinger's dual-spectrum guidance ignored them. The missile's ultraviolet channel filtered out the decoy's signature, tracking the engine plume with unbroken precision. Soviet after-action reports from spring 1987 catalogued the same pattern: flares deployed, missile locked through, impact at the exhaust, total loss. A second modification followed. Heat suppressor shrouds were mounted over the Mi-24's exhausts. These metal sleeves, weighing 180 kilograms, were intended to mask the hottest part of the helicopter's thermal profile. Maintenance crews installed them across regiments, sometimes improvising with sheet metal when factory supplies ran short. The cost was immediate and measurable. The Hind's climb rate, already strained by armor and altitude, dropped from 12.5 meters per second to 11.8 meters per second. On paper, the loss seemed minor, a difference of less than a meter per second. In the geometry of missile engagement, it was fatal. The extra mass pushed the helicopter further into the Stinger's envelope, reducing the already slim chance of outclimbing a missile at Mach 2.2. Pilots described the shrouds as a death tax, a weight that brought no real protection, only the illusion of adaptation. The engineering spiral did not stop there. Crews experimented with mirror panels to reflect incoming heat, with mixed results. Some units tried to reroute exhaust through crude diffusers, but these modifications degraded engine reliability and increased maintenance downtime. Each fix introduced new problems: heavier airframes, slower climbs, more frequent breakdowns. The ASO-2V system, loaded with extra flares, required additional wiring and manual checks before every sortie. Mechanics logged more hours replacing burned-out dispensers than repairing battle damage. The technical dead end was clear to those closest to the machines. In a 1988 regimental log, a chief mechanic wrote, "We do not repair combat damage anymore. We repair the countermeasures." Every adaptation exposed the same flaw. The Mi-24's core design, optimized for a different war, a different enemy, could not be retrofitted to defeat a threat its creators had not imagined. The more weight added in search of protection, the less margin remained for survival. The countermeasure spiral became a cycle of diminishing returns, each step further binding the crews to a system that could not save them. In the aftermath of the Stinger's arrival, the collapse of confidence inside the Mi-24 regiments was swift and public. The elite squadrons, once known as the Grey Wolves, dropped their old call sign. Pilots began referring to themselves as mandatory Matrosovs, a bitter reference to the Soviet infantrymen, ordered to sacrifice themselves against German machine guns in World War II. The new name spread through the barracks and flight logs, a form of dark humor masking the reality that every sortie now felt like a one-way trip. Morale was not the only casualty. Survival kits, once packed with rations and maps, now contained a loaded Makarov pistol with a single round set aside, not for the enemy, but for the pilot himself. Testimony from the 205th Independent Helicopter Regiment describes the shift in chilling terms. Major Viktor Karpukin recalled in a 1991 interview that the pistol was there for them if they were shot down. He said a bullet was better than capture. The dread was not abstract. In the Panjshir Valley, Ahmad Shah Massoud's forces set up ambushes that exploited every weakness of the Hind. Stinger teams waited on the ridgelines, firing in salvos to saturate the sky. In one documented incident in late 1987, 3 Mi-24s were brought down in a single engagement near Kandahar. The official report, signed by Colonel Alexander Rutskoy, described the losses as unacceptable and unsustainable. Rutskoy's December 1987 memo to command did not mince words. "We cannot guarantee air support. Every sortie is a gamble with no winners." The institutional response was to retreat. Regimental logs from 1988 show a sharp drop in sortie rates and an increase in refusals to fly. The engineering premise, that armor equals survival, had been destroyed in practice, but the system clung to its old logic. Pilots were left to improvise their own protocols for survival, or for ending their own lives if survival was no longer possible. The Mi-24's fate in Afghanistan was sealed not by a single weapon, but by the cumulative weight of engineering choices that could not be undone. Doctrine, built on the promise of survivability, broke down under the pressure of physics and enemy adaptation. By the end of 1988, the Hind was no longer a symbol of Soviet power, but of a system's refusal to face the reality its own machines had revealed. In engineering, every protection has a cost. The Mi-24's 10.9 tons of armor, calculated for a European battlefield, became a liability at Afghan altitude, rendering escape geometry impossible against Mach 2.2 missiles with a 79% kill rate. Today, military design still risks fighting the last war, not the next. Survivability is never static. Each new threat rewrites the rules. Thanks for watching. Your perspective matters. Share your thoughts below.